remarks because so many great points have been raised. But it is good to be back here and really reflect the 1 year since Sandy has impacted us. A lot of us have worked through many other storms, certainly nothing as significant as Sandy, but a lot of the lessons are the same, and we hope to learn from that. There are great success stories that come out of this storm, and we shouldn't lose sight on that because those success stories really provide models that we can apply, hopefully, in other areas to apply those models successfully and help people out. There are a lot of problems, and you hear a lot about the problems as well. It's important to recognize those and not really to point blame necessarily, but to make sure that we talk about those problems in the hope that we don't repeat them. So, consistent with the theme of this panel, Designing Differently, a little bit off what I typically would talk about as a geologist who loves to talk about that Barrier Island migration thing that the Admiral touched on. But certainly, I'll highlight several points that seem pretty obvious a year out. And the first thing that's really positive outcome of this whole event is that the residents in these coastal areas, these floodplains, and throughout the state have a much better sense today of their vulnerability and the risk from where they live, from the forces of nature, the water, the waves, the surges. It has not been easy in trying to educate folks about these natural hazards, and the reason it's so important is that it makes a big difference in the decisions that homeowners make, not just relative to their own properties and how they manage their land, how they build their houses, but hopefully it makes a big difference in how these residents can influence public policy and public spending decisions, which are so critical to where we go in the future as we face these storms. So it's a tough way to learn a lesson, but certainly this has been a case in point. Some of the polling Patrick Murray talked about earlier about some of the perceptions, and I had an opportunity to be briefed by Dr. Greenberg at Rutgers as part of the Climate Adaptation Alliance, and it was very interesting to see that folks really do have a good handle and they trust the science, which was surprising to see. They may not trust the government, but they trust the scientists and they trust that work. There are some strong opinions about not having people build in hazardous areas, and it's a very interesting point. Unfortunately, when you keep seeing other questions, for example, are you willing to support public acquisition to prevent people from building in hazardous areas, you don't get a real resounding percentage of that. So we're making progress in that people recognize the hazards, recognize there are areas that we probably should not be occupying, but we haven't quite figured out where people stand on how you get them out of those areas. The other point, next point I'd like to make is that we really need to recognize and appreciate the natural and beneficial functions of our natural resources, of our floodplains, beaches and dunes, our wetlands and wetland buffers. These are the resources that over time we have impaired to the degree that they really don't function as they can in protecting our communities. We've built on them, we've built around them, and we've essentially prevented a lot of these systems from functioning as they would in nature. And as a result, they don't provide the protection that they could. We also spend a lot of money in trying to restore these systems, and that's really a high priority that we must focus on. The only issue that I think we have to look at as we do see a lot of money going into restoration is that really all we're doing? So in other words, you can nourish a beach, you can rebuild a dune, you can restore a wetland, but if we don't have any complementary programs to look at how we manage the land adjacent to these resources, we really are not going to be successful over the long term in making a big difference, because we have these static development lines. Resources are not static. So the result is we can't sustain these resources over time given the current practices that we have. So I'm a big proponent of, if we're going to put a lot of public money into beach nourishment and dune building and wetland restoration, we should also be looking at those land areas adjacent to these restored areas and try to implement some land use management changes that will allow the resources to sustain themselves over time. And what it means is difficult decisions. We're talking about development setbacks, talking about strategic acquisition of property. And without that, we'll continue to pay large costs in resource restoration without the full benefits. And I think we have to look at some non-traditional resource restoration options. And having been in DEP for 30 years, I can tell you it was always a no-no to fill a shallow water bay area. But looking at some of the impacts of the storms and recognizing that we may need to restore our wetlands by filling some of these shallow water areas and recreating those habitats. I think we have to look at things differently in light of Sandy, in light of sea level rise. The other area, and I promised my friend Debbie Mance I would mention this one, relates to oyster restoration in some of our bays. And it has always been promoted for water quality benefits and public education. Obviously, as a shellfish resource, if the water is clean, it's a great thing. And there was always a big concern, particularly in Raritan Bay, about restoring oysters and the fear of people going in and poaching and taking those out. I think we have to look differently at some things that traditionally we took a hard line on, and perhaps look at the benefits, in this case, of these reefs serving as surge barriers and protection for these shoreline areas. One way that I talked about the land use management, the acquisition of property, it highlights the need for funding, and it's sort of preaching to the choir here, but we're lucky to have a lot of federal dollars rolling into the state now, but those dollars will be spent and we'll be back scratching our pockets looking for money to accomplish that. We really need to find a stable source of funding, establish that in New Jersey so we can continue to acquire vulnerable property, not just at the shore, in the Passaic Basin, on the Delaware River, and a lot of problem areas that need attention, and we can't ignore that. In terms of some design issues, we really have to get behind the elevation of structures in areas that are not subject to the V-zone hazard. So these still water flooding areas where folks are now faced with having to elevate the homes pursuant to new FEMA maps. We heard a lot about the mapping. They're inherently underestimate the extent of these flood hazards. FEMA will recommend and publicly acknowledges that. They don't account for sea level rise. But FEMA will also acknowledge the need to incorporate higher elevations above those maps. 2 to 3 feet of higher elevation is what they recommend. So you can fault them for not doing the maps the way we'd like them to, because Congress hasn't mandated they do that. But certainly property owners can make decisions for higher elevation. We should be promoting V-zone construction standards, pile foundations in some of these A zones where we've seen a lot of structural damage from scour and erosion. It's really important that we educate the residents so they know over the long term they can take actions to be more protective. And then just wrapping up 2 other points, our urban areas present a whole different problem. We heard that earlier today. Someone said you can't elevate a brownstone, and that is true. There are a whole series of tools that we have to bring to bear in these urban areas that don't involve elevating buildings because it's often infeasible. We have to look at flood-proofing these existing structures, protecting critical systems, HVAC, electric. In high-rise buildings, we have to do a better job in protecting the elevator systems, these subgrade spaces behind under the high-rises that are connected to multiple buildings have to be addressed because you get flood water in one building and it runs through utility corridors or parking garages to flood the entire block. There's a whole different series of issues in the urban area, and we can't lose sight of those just because they're not shown on television or doesn't appear in the press. And then lastly, we really have to be a lot more humble in how we talk and think about the vulnerability we face. We have to recognize that nature is really the dominant player here and that we are not. And I know it's tough. We're people who have big egos and we like to think that we can conquer everything. We really can't. We have to recognize that. We can't pretend that storms and floods won't impact our communities because they will. But we can be a little bit smarter about how we respond and how we adapt to these conditions. We have to recognize that these are going to prevail in the future. And we have a lot that we can do. Fortunately, we have a lot of money right now that we can do some things differently. And I think as we heard earlier, you need the political will, you need some bold thinking, and we need to recognize that adaptation to future conditions is really our ticket to safer communities throughout the state. So I look forward to the comment section. Tony's shuffling a lot of cards here, so get ready, gang. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And as I'm gathering questions, and I see they're gathering more out there, reminding folks, again, you can email questions to csdforum@uscsusa.org. Or students who are in the room, or maybe on their phones like they're in my class, you can tweet a question by saying hashtag #PostSandy. So thanks for your questions. First is a specific follow-up for Ralph. Does your conversation regarding storm resilience include fuel supplies, such as the ones in Carteret, Linden, which all major terminals were suffering damage in our waterways as a result of their unpreparedness? So how do you work with that?
So two things here. On the fuel side, we've already started to raise the transmission system at Seymour, so we've started that effort. But each of the individual terminals have their own infrastructure that they're dealing with and making some progress on. And then we have the ongoing conversation about whether or not there should be some sort of portable generators in each one of the individual gas stations that are out in the retail space. So along the whole fuel chain, I think there's opportunities for us to make the investments. There's decisions that need to be made along the way, and then again, the question comes down to who's going to pay for each one of those.
Yeah, we'll come back to who pays, because I think that's the question. I mean, obviously you made a point in your industry, it's the right time to do this right now for a whole variety of reasons, and perhaps some of the other solutions aren't quite so well aligned in terms of timing, so that's a question I have. There's another question about sort of a system. So New Jersey Shore is addicted, or we enjoy our seasonal economy and the ensuing wonderful traffic and also the transportation network that comes to the shore. So anybody, what are people's thoughts about what's the investment in some of our road infrastructure and travel infrastructure alternatives, including mass transit or other rail systems? What opportunities are there after Sandy to redesign? Any folks have any thoughts about that?
I'll take the first comment on that. We're big proponents of mass transit. We think there's a lot of opportunities out there for mass transit. We do think, and this was sort of part of the ULI panel, when you're spending dollars, there really needs to be that cost-benefit analysis of how many people are really benefiting from those dollars spent. So we encourage those dollars to be spent in the right areas that are, many people are benefiting, and not just few.
I guess the issue of mass transit, when you think of it, we really don't have that infrastructure in place now to get to a lot of the coastal areas. So you can think of the coastline that will get you as far as Bayhead. And our family lived in Lavallette for many years, and we were always schlepping up there to pick people up at Bayhead. But I think the bigger concern is how are we going to ensure that we're able to evacuate people off these very heavily developed barrier islands in a hurricane scenario that is a summer event. Sandy occurred in late October, and timing is fortuitous in terms of the relatively few people who are in these barrier island communities. But you look at Long Beach Island, you have one way on and off that island, Route 72, and it's a real challenge for these communities to plan for that. So I look at that a little differently in terms of evacuation planning and hazards.
I'll add too, because that's something we've thought a lot about in thinking about how to reposition tourism along the Jersey Shore. We were really surprised at the fact that I think it's 89% of all people who visit the shore come by car. And if you're going to the barrier islands, it's 95%, which is compelling both about the fact that maybe the options that you need aren't really there. Ferry no longer goes to a lot of the places. There's no water taxi system. So it's not just kind of the heavy rail infrastructure, but maybe there's some other seasonal infrastructure or temporary systems we could overlay. I think another part has to do with what we keep talking about, which is the kind of land use planning piece, that maybe some of this isn't working because the development isn't in the right place. so if we can think about future, more stable development that happens near where you already have some rail stations, that could maybe increase ridership too.
So Tony, I just say something, you saw right from our service territory, it's a really nice place to visit in Jersey City, Newark, and other parts inland, so come inland and spend some of your money there.
There you go.
Tony, I just want to add one more.
I deliberately left out that Montclair State reference, by the way, just saying that.
I want to make one more comment. Is one of the things that came out of the study was a lot of these barrier islands really started to explode more when governments, various governments, started to put infrastructure in place, roads, sewer, water. You know, we're not in favor of spending those dollars to encourage further development in these highly sensitive areas.
Great, yeah, there was something, Cultural Area Resources Act, where we're supposed to do that. We obviously put a lot of infrastructure, which actually is a good transition to this next question, which is for those who are designing differently or are focused on stormwater and stormwater infrastructure. We heard earlier that perhaps we have some good rules, but it's not very well implemented in New Jersey, and we've heard about the Dutch talk about designing with water now, so I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts on what communities can do, but also what industry leaders can do in helping to think differently about designing and supporting stormwater and stormwater infrastructure.
So I'll just, let me just give you from a utility standpoint, you know, that's a question that's in our proposal. Do we want to harden the overhead system? Do we want to bury it? Very expensive. And do you want to make it submersible, which is even more expensive? So these are the challenges that face, and it gets back to a choice that we have to make as a society and policymakers have to make. Are we willing to take an outage for an overhead line? Do we want to spend $1 million a mile to underground it? Or do we want to spend even more to make them submersible?
Other thoughts on yeah, just a few points on that. And obviously in our urban areas, it's a major problem because of the level of impervious cover. The systems are old. You get a lot of flooding that comes back through the storm systems and upwells through stormwater pipes back into the community. But certainly there are ways that, and a lot of communities are looking at urban forestry as a tool to deal with some of what we heard earlier, the heat island effect of these communities, but also to promote some infiltration. One thing we have to be careful is we don't think of Sandy as the only problem we have to manage. I mean, we have a lot of urban flooding that happens from just heavy rainstorms, and you get a couple of inches of rain during a day, and it causes a lot of problems. So we have to look at these incremental vulnerabilities, and while we may not be able to prevent Sandy from wreaking havoc like it did, or the next Sandy, we can certainly do a lot to deal with these more frequent, lower intensity storms that are equally problematic.
And I'll just add, I think, you know, it's one thing to know what the right thing is to do in terms of green infrastructure, or to draw it and make a street look pretty and look functional and productive, but it's another thing to implement it and to build it and then to maintain new systems, which, you know, permeable paving, there's some challenges there. So I think, especially at the local level of small communities where we want this to happen, but people may not know yet how to do it. Engineers may not know, you know, what the best practices are, or how to implement it. We need to think about training at that local level too, and getting, you know, maybe through grants or other items, you know, getting assistance so that people can actually implement it. We can go from a drawing that just sits there to something that works.
Great. This is directed at Chris primarily, but mentioned other folks, so it's, and maybe Mark. How is Edgewood Properties or Langen Engineering or PSE&G or SASACI, how many of you all significantly changed designs, or have you actually changed thinking about designs of projects that you've been working on? Obviously, P&G redesigning many of its systems, but the concept of how as a result of Sandy, has that actually practically impacted the way you're doing your work, thinking about the way you're doing your work in New Jersey?
I know one question we're immediately asking, which usually didn't get asked until later, is, you know, who's your insurance company and who are you insuring this with? And, you know, are you with Factory Mutual, or who are you with? And, you know, one of the first things to get established is what do they require your finished floor elevation to be? Because it used to be 100-year plus 1 foot, or, you know, something similar, and now it may be 500-year plus 2 feet. You know, each of these insurance companies is governing differently, so that has a big impact of the way we're doing business.
I can give you one example, Tony. We recently acquired a Pfizer plant up in Morris Plains, right on Tabor Road, and it's squeezed between the highway and the Montauk Brook. Terrible flooding problems in the area. Redevelopment projects provide a great opportunity to make enhancements, and what we've done is we've demolished a lot of the structures in the floodplain along the brook, and we are promoting a plan to excavate and create additional flood storage for protection of our property as we redevelop, but also for the community. And it was pretty well received. I talked to folks about the advantages of doing brownfield redevelopment, where you can go into these crummy, contaminated sites and actually improve the conditions and get the communities to support your work because they want to see that blighted site redeveloped, and there are opportunities to do some good environmental enhancements in that, so where we can.
We've had a couple projects in the past 5 years that have had to change in the middle because a flood event has happened in the middle of the project, and so it does shift how you approach it. One is Cedar Rapids, which I showed, and we started that project the day of the flood, and it was supposed to just be a riverfront park for the community, and the day of the kickoff, the flood happened, and it totally changed everyone's perspective, and it changed the project, and it was only 5 years later that park got built, and now it's integrated with the levee. It's a totally different place and a totally different function. So that was a wholesale change, and similarly, it happened again. Also, in the Midwest, we were working in Council Bluffs on a riverfront park there, and a flood happened in the middle, and you realize that you have to think about different plant species then, because the plants there were underwater for 2 months at a time, and then they experience extreme droughts the other part of the time. So it really does kind of change your perspective when you're confronted with it.
Great. I think this was mentioned in a couple of the presentations, but there's a question about how do you encourage an effort also, or how do you accommodate an effort to incorporate cultural and historic preservation into the community conversation about rebuilding, and how, if you have any examples, have you specifically addressed that in any of your projects or activities?
That was a question in Cedar Rapids too, because the flood engulfed the downtown and a lot of the kind of historic neighborhoods near downtown. And so there was a lot of mapping and thinking about the cultural resources that people hadn't really identified as a community before. So we did that, and then we worked with them a bit to figure out if some of those cultural resources needed to be moved and relocated, and what you could do then in the place, so that you could still kind of memorialize the place where they were before. So that was a critical issue there. We're trying to think about that too in Rebuild by Design, and it seems that the cultural component is one of the most resilient elements, versus some of our infrastructure or environmental aspects. And so trying to build on what is really strong along the coast in terms of culture, whether that's elements of the beach culture, and reinterpret it somehow.
Regarding historic, this goes back to sort of one of Mark's comments as far as in the urban areas, the other challenges or the further challenges you have. Whether you're in New York or Philadelphia or really any of these older areas, we run into it in Philadelphia a lot. Strict stormwater management requirements. You're on a small site, you're required to recharge, yet you're next to a historic structure with a basement. That you start to introduce stormwater next to that, you're for sure to get leaks and potential issues with foundations, and that is something in the regulations that really is a constant struggle to meet the regulations, yet really take into account those specific site issues.
One thing that folks may want to check out is FEMA deployed what's called a mitigation assessment teams after the storm, and the purpose of these groups was to go out and survey building damage and do forensic analysis of what they saw with the eye of improving codes and standards. But it was interesting that they had 4 teams, a coastal team, a high-rise team, critical facilities team, and a historic structures team. So it does show you that the federal government found it was important enough to deploy a group of folks to look at damage to historic structures and try to come up with ways to mitigate those through the reconstruction in a way that preserves the character of those buildings. It's always a challenge. The minute you go to alter a structure for any reason, it's a problem if it's a designated historic structure. Those reports are all available at the FEMA library. For whomever asked that question, reference that.
Great. I like this question from Twitter. It's kind of basic, but I think powerful. Why is it one of the most basic design opportunities just to remove vast amounts of impervious surface and paving and undo some things that we've done?
That is a good option. You know, with the local planning, it takes a lot of education. Right? It takes a lot of education with a lot of the boards. In certain instances, in many instances, developers are forced, quite frankly, to put in more parking than is required. I think that mindset is starting to change, to really get an appreciation to preserve what can be preserved. But you know, I think there's been a history with the development community and the regulators that it's sort of been, you know, this side here and this side here, and finally we're starting to have discussions. We're sort of meeting in the middle for all the right reasons, and I think that really is just starting to happen.
Great. This is kind of a little specific about maybe a broader one, which is the question of energy efficiency and renewable energy, and what do you see the place for that in terms of all of our design approaches? What do we think about in terms of alternative energies or energy efficiency, and how important should that be in our thinking about designing for the future?
So we've been very clear from our company standpoint that energy efficiency is number one. That's the cheapest way to save or create electricity is by saving some electricity. So that needs to be pursued, and needs to be pursued heavier every single day. We've actually seen in New Jersey, if you step back over the last 5 years, the load growth has flattened, has not started to drop off. So that's the total load. People still like to use their air conditioners on a really hot day. So as a result, we've still got to build the infrastructure for those peak demands. But the overarching load has flattened out, and that's starting to come down. On the renewable front, it's the same. It's the same issue that I've spoken about before. Right now, it is still more expensive on a total per watt basis to generate electricity from renewable resources than it is from some of the centralized generation resources. It's just a fact, whether it's through subsidies or tax breaks or something else. It's the total all-in cost is more expensive. The question is who's willing to pay for that. At some point, we were at the forefront. We still are at the forefront as a state on renewables, so our policy is to follow that. That's why you see some of the panels up on the poles, and we've done a lot of brownfield follow-up on renewables, but it becomes a question of society and how much cost they're willing to bear.
And just to add to that, that's absolutely true. I think one of the arguments is that we have to look at all of the costs involved. So you heard today Governor Whitman talking about the impact of pollution and smog on human health. What is the cost of not moving to renewables in terms of the impact on greenhouse gas, climate change, sea level rise, and all these other things? So we don't always do a great job societally on quantifying all the costs, and when we do cost benefits, it's generally limited to, if it's the Army Corps, they look at it pretty narrowly. FEMA has their way of looking at it, and companies do as well. But I think we have to broaden our views and sharpen the pencils to look at all of the cost to society, and then you might see things balanced a little bit differently.
Great. I think we'll have to conclude just with one last question and give everybody a shot. So building a bridge between the last panel and this one is really, what are your thoughts on how we build community supporter education so that communities are the ones who are asking for designing differently or implementing differently? So how do we actually engage them in the recovery that they need right now, but also to actually help support these more innovative and different approaches for the future? Thoughts about how we do that?
One grant that we're looking to hopefully get locally on an Urban Land Institute side is to help create what we're calling a mayor's college, to help educate mayors and other leaders, elected officials, particularly at the municipal level, who generally, don't have that type of capacity. Many of them are part-time. So to really educate them on preparedness and resilience to really start there with the leadership in each of these municipalities and help it. You know, you have other grassroots initiatives, but that's one where we want to make sure to get the leadership educated.
Great.
I would say, you know, specific to utilities, look, we were a big problem during Sandy. There's no offense or buts about it. And really what we have to have a conversation about, and you heard this during the last panel, is a little bit about accountability. I heard a lot about federal accountability, heard a lot about state accountability, town accountability, but there's also individual accountability. And so, you know, when I left my home and said goodbye to my family, when Sandy hit, my family was out of power for 10 days. I tried to do my best to have them ready for what they faced. Now, we could do that for everybody, but the question is back to whose accountability and where does that payment get to? So I'd like to have the conversation and get people to talk about design and do things differently by talking about the accountability. Is it the accountability at the home? Is it the accountability at the municipality? Or is it the accountability at the state or federal level?
Great. Mark, you have a final thought?
I think, you know, a lot of it, and it not only applies to that point, but also to some of what we heard earlier about how do you compel better planning and land use management. And I think really it's through how we dole out public money to a lot of these communities. It can be a really powerful carrot to provide incentives for good planning, good practices, good design. And conversely, withholding money can be a really powerful stick. And not to be vindictive, but you know, we have to look at the realities of the taxpayers really subsidizing a lot of the problems that are out there and the causes and the effects. So better use of public dollars and not necessarily just throwing it around, but being strategic in how it's spent with conditions to promote the good practices, the good planning. I think that's a really powerful tool.
Well, we spend a lot of our time on project work doing community outreach or trying to think about how to do outreach. Every public meeting, I think, is an opportunity for, you know, some of that education about these land use issues, about sustainability issues. But it is, the truth of the matter is it's hard and it takes a lot of time and you don't always get the participation that you want or that is meaningful to the process. And so I think we do need to think about all the different ways that people, you know, will respond or the best way to reach them, whether it's social media or other processes that are more engaging too, so we can perhaps learn from them as much as we try to kind of educate as well.
Great, thank you very much. Let's give our closing remarks. Appreciate it very much.